Ladies and gentlemen, Reliance Entertainment welcomes you to a rare and fascinating evening. It's our pleasure to have with us today the most influential filmmaker in the history of global cinema, the highest box office grossing director of all times, and three-time Academy Award winner, Mr. Steven Spielberg. In conversation with one of the greatest actors in the history of Indian cinema and one of our finest intellectual minds, Mr. Amitabh Bachchan.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Still trying to recover from this promotion that we just saw. So overwhelming and a huge body of work.
That's a lot of shots up there.
Yeah. Welcome to India, Mr.
Thank
Spielberg, and thank you for being with us today. Obviously, this isn't your very first visit to India, is it?
No, I've been here several times before, but not. It's been 30 years since I've been back to India. I was here. The last time was in 1983.
Were you making films then?
Yes, Temple of Doom, and I was here on my own, backpacking through the country.
Where did you go?
But everywhere.
Really?
Yes, Benares, Calcutta, Delhi, Jodhpur, Jaipur, a lot of places. But I started here in 1977, and I shot a very small scene from my movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind in a very small town, about 3-hour drive outside of Bombay.
Oh.
And that was the, so
I
I was
doubt
here.
very many people know that. What was it that impressed you most about India at that point of time, when you were backpacking?
I think that people were welcoming of a foreigner, that they would invite me to eat with them. They would invite me to stay with them. They didn't know who I was. It was after I had made Jaws and after certainly Close Encounters came out. It was so great that nobody knew who I was. I remember that as being one of the happiest moments of my life. The relative anonymity of just traveling through India.
Is that something surprising for you, or is that something that isn't very prevalent in the United States of America?
No. There's no anonymity there. You know, you can be an actor in one television show that everybody watches, and that's the end of your privacy. It's over.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Spielberg, you started off very early in your life. I believe as a child you once took an 8mm camera and made your first film with your mother being in the star cast.
Yes, I did.
What inspired you to do that?
Well, I think well, for one thing, the first time I picked up a movie camera was because I was wrecking my electric trains when I was about 12 years old. I was crashing the two trains into each other and making a complete mess, and sometimes the trains would break and my dad would have to take them back to the electric train store to get them fixed, and he told me if I ever broke my trains again, he would take the entire set away. And we had an 8mm Kodak movie camera. And I remember coming home from school one day and setting up a couple of shots, and I photographed the trains crashing. And luckily the trains didn't break, but I had it on film. I got one train going left to right, then inside the camera I stopped, I put the camera on the other train, keeping the screen direction right, the other train going right to left. And I set the camera down, shooting straight out at the track, and both trains came together and crashed. And then what I wound up doing was looking at that piece of film, 90 seconds of film, over and over and over again, and it satisfied my need for some reason to break things in those days. And in that sense, I discovered the power of cinema.
Right.
And I started making little movies after that.
Yes. Your first film was Duel.
Yes.
Very unusual topic, very unusual subject. A truck on a highway chasing a man in a car. And I remember seeing it, many, many years ago, and just overawed by the concept of that film. What drove you to making a film like that?
well, the great thing about movies is before the director, there must be a writer. And Duel was totally conceived by Richard Matheson, a great science fiction fantasy writer. And he had written this amazing story, and I was the lucky beneficiary of having my assistant at the time read the story. It was a short story in Playboy magazine. And my assistant came over to me, and I was just a young television director, but we all had secretaries. And she said, I think this is right up your alley. I think you should make this into a movie. And she gave me the Richard Matheson short story. And then she found out that it was in fact going to be a TV movie for ABC. And she encouraged me, if I liked the story, to go apply for the job, which I did. I went out and I kind of imposed myself on met the producer who was producing it and tried to talk my way into getting the job. And that's how it all began.
The one thing that really caught my attention in Duel was the very effective use of sound effects. Every time the truck would appear, there would be just the sound of the truck, which was almost frightening, the way it was cut. Was that deliberate?
Well, the truck, had a presence that was very important. I really thought it was a monster movie. I mean, I approached it like a Japanese Toho monster movie. Instead of Godzilla, I had this 18-wheeler, obviously empty because it didn't blow up at the end, tanker truck. And there was something about creating a kind of oral threat to it, a real, auditory menace. And so we had some really young and new sound effects artists working in television at Universal at the time, who came up with a leitmotif to give the truck a kind of personality through just sound effects. So a lot of the truck is a sense of the vibration, a very low bass whenever the truck came by.
Yes.
They recorded the truck going by all the time, but then they did some doctoring to the sound and got the truck in a much lower, deeper register.
You've always had a desire to do something different all the time. Whether it's a duel, whether it's a shark or an extraterrestrial being. How do you make these decisions on doing something different?
Well, I think what happens is, I don't go...
A lot of the actors actually are being threatened by this. I hope you know that.
Well, as I've
Because
aged...
the greatest remembrance that all actors are going to, think of is that, the best actors is a fish, a robot, and somebody from outer space.
Yes, but as I move beyond middle age into that unspecified period of time, I've actually turned to actors to save my career. So I turned to Daniel Day-Lewis, I turned to Tom Hanks, I turned to Leonardo DiCaprio. So I have made my case with the actors to make more actor-based films. But when I was first starting out, I love big, high-concept movies. I like the idea. If the idea made me want to see the movie, then I wanted to figure out how can you write to that idea and really put it on display. So in my younger years, I did a lot of conceptual figuring out how to make a movie around a shark. Now, of course, I had the help of a book. Richard Matheson wrote Duel, and Peter Benchley wrote the novel Jaws. And so about 3/4 of my films all come from books. And because of that, you've already got a leg up. Half the work's already been done.
Yes. But you have switched to working with actors. And
I always work with actors, but
they just don't happen to be a fish and a robot.
Exactly.
But even in the casting process, I've noticed that they've been very unusual. Tom Hanks as a soldier, for example. Why would you have thought that?
Well, Tom's a great leader. I mean, Tom has profound leadership abilities, and it comes through in a lot of his work on the screen. Yeah, he started as a comedian. He started doing a television show, called Bosom Buddies, where he was always dressed as a woman every day. And he started, doing jokes, and he started in comedy. But there was, in every comedy actor, there is a very serious dramatic actor. You really can't do great comedy unless you have a deep dramatic core. And Tom always had that, and Tom always had a penchant for drama. And as Tom matured, his films became more serious, and Tom and I became friends. I produced 3 movies that Tom was in as an actor, and we got to know each other really well. And I just thought Tom could do anything. He could be a politician, he could be the President of the United States, for that matter. And so it wasn't that far of a reach to imagine Tom playing Captain John Miller.
Right. You've always apparently enjoyed the Bond movies.
I love the Bond movies.
And would you say that Indiana Jones was a kind of a inspiration from Bond films or a tribute to Bond films?
Well, not really, because when George Lucas came up with the idea of Indiana Jones, he was basing his concept on the movies that Republic Studios used to make. These serialized adventures that would show in between a double feature back in the 1940s and early 50s. You'd have a feature, then you'd have a bunch of cartoons, then you'd have a newsreel, and then they would show a kind of 14-minute segment of a movie with a cliffhanger at the end of it. And they do 15 or 16 of these little interstitials. And by the end of it, you saw an entire movie, each one having a thrilling cliffhanger. So the Indiana Jones concept was based on the old serials from those black and white American serial days.
Ever thought of directing a Bond film?
I tried to direct a Bond film, and Cubby Broccoli wouldn't hire me. You know, I went to Cubby and I called him up on the phone, and I just said, I had done a couple of movies. I had just started out. I had actually done Jaws, and it was a big hit, and I thought, well, that'll convince him that I can direct a Bond picture. And I got him on the telephone, and I said, I really would love to do your next Bond picture. And he said, you're not experienced enough. You know, and he said, if we ever do one on the water, I'll call you. And so that was the end of that. And then a number of years later, after Close Encounters came out, you know, in Close Encounters, there's a 5-note sequence that the aliens send to us, and then we send those 5 notes back to the aliens. So Cubby was making Moonraker, and he wanted to use the 5-note sequence as a parody on Close Encounters in the Bond film. But he needed my permission. Thank God for the Directors Guild of America. They really protect us. They really do. So he called me, got me at the office, and he asked if he could use those 5 notes. And I immediately said yes, and then I said, do you have a slot open? I've made 2 huge hits, Jaws and Close Encounters. I got nominated for Oscars on both films. And he said, did you win? I said, no. He said, well, no. No, not this time. Later, I'm making a movie in 1986. I was the second unit director, and I produced a movie which I wrote the story. Dick Donner was the director. It was called The Goonies. Mm-hmm. And in the film, a kid who loved the James Bond films plays the James Bond theme on a little ghetto blaster he's wearing around his neck, across his chest. But I needed the rights to the Bond theme. And I had given Cubby Broccoli the rights to my 5 notes, so I called Cubby on the phone. I said, I'm making this little picture. There's a really nice homage to James Bond. This kid comes flying in on a bungee cord, and he lands in this room, and he's playing the James Bond theme. And can I get the rights? And Cubby said, no. And I said, Cubby, I gave you free of charge the 5 notes from Close Encounters of Their Kind. He said, the Bond theme is 7 notes. But he eventually finally gave me that. So that was my consolation prize. He would never hire me to do Bond, no matter how successful my career, he would never let me in the front door, but I got the notes for free.
Yeah. But, Mr. Spielberg, you've been a producer, director, an executive producer. How do you decide which particular project of yours you're going to executive produce? And have there been occasions sometimes when you felt that, much like Cubby did, that a particular film or a story was not worth putting your name to it and withdrawn from it?